You're gonna need a bigger boat. So serious. I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the InSession Film Podcast.
Welcome to the new podcast presented by the female film critics of InSession Film. We are speaking, we love movies, we are women in session. I know we said we weren't going to talk about the Oscars, but we have to talk about the Oscars. But, you know, we're sprinkling a little historical Oscar talk. We're dipping our toe in the water with some past Oscars. And we have some opinions. We have some negative opinions. I've been the negative Nelly recently, but we're all getting together for a little bit of awards hate. I'm Kristin Battestella, also writing at Therefore Review. Amy Thomasson, our drama teacher by day and social film critic by night, is here again. You're a Thomasson 11. You can complain to us on Twitter. We love the love on Twitter, but if you have to complain, we understand. Zita Short of the 300 Passions podcast is here, and we thought, where can we begin with our Oscar complaints? You know, a couple of our other girls, Erica and Shadan, have mentioned going through the Best Picture lists to get some ideas of what to watch in the classics. And we both thought, oh, what a nice list, and kind of scoffed as well, because some of the Best Picture nominees are questionable at best, shall we say. And, you know, Amy Thomasson is here with us. She's written How Were These Not Nominated series at InSessionFilm.com. Amy Smith, our awards editor at InSession, is doing our contemporary Chasing the Gold, the hot mess that is this year's award season. But we are going to talk about our most hated Best Picture nominees. And, you know, I kind of had to ask, how are we narrowing this down? Are we doing our most hated tops list? Are we going by decades? Because it's a deep list. You can get really involved. I got a little more angry as the more I kind of got into my research. I have to start in the 80s because I'm old enough to remember the 80s. And trying to narrow down this window was very frustrating, because to me, when you think of Best Picture, I'm going on a rant. If you don't recognize it by name, I don't think it should have been nominated for Best Picture. And I grew up in the 80s, and there's a couple of these films that I'm like, I didn't even remember this film. Did this film exist? What is this name? Yeah, there's some questionable ones. Amy, you had a couple other problematic 80s films on your list.
The 80s was a rough decade, man. Because going through the list, I limited it to obviously movies I have actually watched. Now, I know in the 30s, there's a lot of problematic films, but even with a film like Cimarron, we also, audience, only picked movies that were only nominated. We did not include winners in our list, because there's a bunch that would have been whatever won that year, and that would be a completely different list. But Cimarron, very problematic. However, cinematically achieved things in the 1930s that are kind of shocking. So it had spectacle. It has moments of interesting. But the movies in the 80s, we know better. And these movies are just sentimental shock.
Because I was a kid for a lot of the 80s, and I feel like I got the impression that the Oscars were more for art house or obscure or only dramas, because it seemed like that's what they all were. And I don't know, is that when the critic divide kind of happened? Because you had blockbusters kind of began late 70s and the 80s. And I feel like that's when things got to diverge, because even as a kid, I thought I'm not watching these. I guess I thought they were adult or mature movies. I'm watching the fun 80s movies and they're the ones that have lasted. I mean, you think of Back to the Future, you know, or something, big movies of the 80s. You don't think of, if you hear me scrolling angrily through this list, I mean, and maybe some of them are good, or I need to give them rewatches, but I mean, Tess or Atlantic City Missing, Tender Mercies, The Dresser, but are they Best Picture worthy?
No, well, okay. I think the thing about the Oscars, the thing I sort of like about them, I think they have very bad taste. I would not describe the members of the Academy as great cinephiles who have a deep and passionate love of cinema. They are people who work in the film industry. And in a lot of cases, especially in the past, it was retirees who had not appeared in or worked on a film in 25 years. And they're considering, "Oh, what did I go to see with my grandson over the summer? And what film was my wife talking about when she came back from her trip overseas?" That sort of thing. The thing I like about them as a person who went through every single Best Picture nominee and tried to watch all of them, they sort of have weirder taste than you expect them to, in that their reputation deservedly is that they reward middlebrow, stodgy films that make an attempt to be pretentious and to serve as sort of Hollywood versions of art films, but that happen to be very on the nose, very didactic, lacking in formalistic pleasures. And so you end up with a lot of very dull films nominated for Best Picture that do not stand the test of time. And yet, I think that might be their greatest value as an institution. You get this sense of what was hot or what people were talking about at that very specific moment. So in a way, even though this whole discussion is us complaining about bad films that have been nominated, I find it more fascinating that it's not just the critical consensus, in that, yes, you get this with critics too. You look back and you think, why did Gene Siskel give this awful film a 3.5-star rating in 1982? But even more so with the Academy, it gives us a sense of how tastes have changed and evolved over time, and how our views on cinema might have developed beyond what people were thinking about in, say, the 80s. And they're never going to take risks, I don't think. We're never going to get a Best Picture lineup that is truly interesting. If you want great cinema, look at the Cannes Film Festival lineup, look at a critic's year-end list. But if you want sort of a picture of where people were at socially, politically in 1977, looking at the Best Picture lineup can reveal a lot. Sorry for that whole spiel, but getting back... Sorry.
I feel like, and just really quick before we get into our lists, I feel like the 80s and the very early 90s, the pictures that were nominated for Best Picture were also movies that were like the highest grossing films of those years. You look at 1988, I mean, Fatal Attraction, that was a massive movie when it came out. Moonstruck, a lot of those movies that were nominated, everybody saw. And nowadays, it's very different. I know people who are like, I don't even know what's nominated. I've never even heard of these movies. When Parasite won, I saw that movie alone because nobody I knew in South Carolina had heard of it. And me saying, hey, it won the Cannes, the Palme d'Or at the Cannes Film Festival, that wasn't enough, especially once they said it was in a foreign language. But I feel like in the 80s, looking at the list, those movies were huge movies that everybody went to see. And I feel like that's changed a lot. I also feel, and this is just probably off topic, I personally like when there were only 5 nominees for Best Picture. Yes. I don't like, because I feel like now that they've made it 10, they're throwing a lot of mediocrity up there that, no, it should be a tight 5.
Mm-hmm. When you look at the early 80s compared to the later 80s, you really see the difference. I mean, before we started, we were chuckling about Places in the Heart. And as Zita said, some of this does seem like it is a lot of like what your grandparents, little old lady would watch or something. And Amy said it's like a TV movie. And you see the difference between something like Places in the Heart and Platoon. Yeah.
Yes.
And
Pritzi's
like
Honor. How did that get nominated?
I said to you before we started, like I had Places in the Heart was stuck in like the middle of like the taped off TV VHS, and it made me hate it more. And I tried to see, well, maybe is it a better drama? But then in the early, you start to think, even with 5, you're like, wow, they were really grasping at straws for some of these nominees.
But when you've got 10, I have a more recent, comparatively speaking, and it's because I think they opened it up to 10. But
yes,
I had talked about this before, like because the hot mess of the 30s, and sometimes you're looking at the number of films that are nominated there is just all over the place because they're combining years and it's like what was happening.
I kind of, sorry, as you point out, the 30s were a mess. They were crazy. Sometimes I love that element of it, especially because you look through these lineups and in a lot of cases, they were nominating comedies. There's good comedies, not the sort of crap that we get nowadays. And I think it does give you a real appreciation of the fact that populist cinema was just better back then. And so sometimes you look through and you find a hidden gem of the sort that would never be nominated today. And then other times you think, oh God, The House of Rothschild is here. That's the film that tried to be, you could say, woke circa 1934 and thought it was really saying something about anti-Semitism. But today looks like a horrible anti-Semitic relic that hates Jewish people, even though it thinks that it doesn't.
Speaking of old people out of touch, one of the first things that I put on my list of kind of not ranking all over the place, we've discussed before on your 300 Passions podcast, Zita, the 1936 Romeo and Juliet. Again, it's another one of those, oh, it's Shakespeare, it's got Norma Shearer, that therefore it means it's an automatic best picture, even if the movie stinks and you've got like 30, 40, 50-year-old people playing like Shakespeare teenagers, and it's just a horrible movie. Is it the worst? No, but again, you're like, that was nominated in a year where there were like 13 Best Picture nominees. You're like, why? What was going on there?
Well, I'm going to stick up for it. Obviously, we disagreed on that podcast.
Is it Leslie Howard in that? And you're a Leslie Howard fan. Yep. As soon as you said it, I'm like, she likes it. Leslie Howard's in it.
He's not especially good in it, I will admit. This is a weak performance from him. This is not Pygmalion, which I think he's wonderful in. But I do think it's a fascinating experiment. And I appreciate the fact that this is a Shakespeare adaptation that has a really strong take on the material. I think the idea of trying to recenter Juliet's perspective and to make her the protagonist instead of being sort of a supporting player in the proceedings is fascinating. Do they completely pull it off without a hitch? No, but there's still a lot to appreciate there. I think Norma Shearer's interpretation of Juliet is quite impressive, even though she's definitely miscast. Of course, the two of them are far too old to be playing these roles. And yet, at the same time, I think they're much better in these parts than the much younger actors that they cast to play these roles in the 1968 version.
Whoa. Let's not let's settle down here.
They have a grasp on the
because
verse.
They're 40 and they've studied it for 500 years.
Yes,
that's why.
But they're better actors, I would say. Sorry, Olivia Hussey. But you can tell with the 1968 version that both of those kids don't really understand what they're saying. And so there's a lot of impassioned shouting in that movie. And the 1936 version largely avoids that approach.
Yeah, but because they're old. If you had just had them be some old forbidden couple instead of pretending they were playing teenage characters, as opposed to, I don't mind if there's flaws with teenagers actually being the young
But I
lover.
would also say that's how teenagers are. I teach middle
beautiful
school.
movie.
They are emotional. They yell. They cry very easily.
Oh, this is a debate. Another
Okay.
topic being added to the
Do you
list.
want to get to our lists?
Yeah, Zita, did you have any surprises in the 80s or the 30s since we're bouncing all around?
Oh, well, okay. I'm going to defend the 80s briefly. This is one of my character flaws. 80s badness to me has a certain charm. I can tell that a lot of these films are, from a semi-objective perspective, not well made. And yet I am sort of won over by the itchiness of it all. And I would take an awful 80s movie over a mediocre 50s or 60s movie anytime. I just think that they're more fun than a lot of these films made in other eras. And I can notice that there are problems with, say, The Big Chill, which Amy addressed. And yet, I think it's sort of fine as a comfort watch, as a turn your brain off and sit back and relax movie. I think it's all right. And perhaps it also speaks to, and I think we can all relate to this as people who grew up in an age where you would get videos and you could watch older movies at home. As a child, I watched a lot of 80s movies. And so despite the fact that I did not grow up in that era, I still feel this bizarre nostalgia for that time period. And so the film has an emotional hold on me in a way. And I feel that way about a lot of these nominees. And I would also note that it's sort of an interesting decade, something like The Last Emperor winning. That's an odd choice, I would say. Yes, it's a period piece and it's a biopic about an important historical figure, but it's still a lot more idiosyncratic in terms of its perspective than a lot of the later versions of that sort of story. And so I didn't find it. Sorry.
I didn't put that on my list because I thought it was a win.
Yeah.
But that would be on my one of the movies that should not have won at all.
Oh, why?
Like, it was a big, beautiful spectacle. It is also one of the most boring movies I have ever watched. And it took me several times to make it through that movie. Like I sat down, I had to like mentally psych myself up to be like, today is the day that we're going to watch this freaking movie. And Peter O'Toole is in it. And I was like, love me some Peter O'Toole. But it was up against far more interesting and thought-provoking films.
I remember
Fatal Attraction, I'm Looking at You.
When that won, I felt like, oh, okay, it won Best Picture, so it's supposed to be good, so I should watch it. And then I was like, yeah, this is kind of a chore, but I guess it was supposed to be good. And it was strange because, yes, like we were living in this kind of feel good, like sunshiny kind of 80s. And then, yeah, there were still these kind of faux prestige films, I guess, kind of taking over. And I feel like we got into that safety of, yes, even a bad 80s movie is kind of fun. But then when I saw, you know, heavy acclaimed cinema in the 90s that blew my mind, it was like, oh, this is how cinema should be. It's not like, yeah, just fun films for boomers.
But movies,
but I'm not the kind of person that says, okay, boomer either.
But yeah, but
back, you're like, yeah.
the Last Emperor beating, again, I think it also beat like Broadcast News. Again, interesting film. Nope is like when another incredibly long, boring movie, The English Patient, won over Fargo. These movies are barely watchable. I don't understand the love for these movies. And no, it's not just because of Seinfeld. But
I
just these bloated, boring. And that's the thing. I can sit through long movies. David Lean epics, bring them on. I can sit through Dr. Zhivago, Lawrence of Arabia, Bridge on the River Kwai. And it's like, you know what? It is actually possible to make a beautiful cinematic film, but also as an interesting plot.
Interesting
characters and dialogue.
I thought
It's possible.
Okay.
We're
I
getting so
far
excited. It's
prefer
funny.
the 80s run of nominees, and I think you do get the occasional art house film in there. You get an Atlantic City, you get something like Tess. The 90s, to me, with a couple of exceptions, when I was going through, were just a bland decade. There's something sort of, it's like grey paste, a lot of these movies. They're just gruel. There's nothing distinctive about them. They're feel-good movies that seemingly got in there because Harvey Weinstein did a lot of glad handing. And that's not the 90s as a whole. Obviously, it's a very vibrant decade for cinema. But you do notice that Krzysztof Kieslowski's films don't get nominated, even though they were a very big deal in the early 90s. And you just get a lot of movies like Shine making it in there. The most generic biopic about a tortured musician, it doesn't really have much going for it. I am baffled by the fact that Geoffrey Rush won Best Actor for this. And I feel as though this is one of those times when the Academy really failed to reflect the zeitgeist. And maybe I'm less hard on them in the 80s, in that is a decade in which movies were a little bit stodgy in general. And I can sort of live with that. Whereas with the 90s, I look at Dances with Wolves and think, why were people losing their minds over this?
But you also have, and I'm going to disagree with you here. You had Dances with Wolves. You also had Goodfellas, which is one of the greatest movies of all time.
Yeah.
You also have and yes, Miramax, Harvey Weinstein, problematic. However, you also have Tarantino, who was a new voice. You have the Coen brothers. You will have that run of British comedies like The Full Monty and Four Weddings and a Funeral, which are very interesting. You had a couple foreign films. You had Il Postino nominated for Best Picture. You had Life is Beautiful nominated for Best Picture. You had there was a lot going on in the 90s, and I feel like it was the introduction of a lot of fresh and interesting perspectives.
Speaking of long, old, and dry movies, I was trying to look this up because when you said, films that you can't, that are just a chore, a slog, I had to look up Empire of the Sun was not nominated for Best Picture. And that was Steven Spielberg. And you're like, oh, okay. So that's another thing, how these lists are misleading. You see nominees that you're like, why was that there? And then you see the things that weren't nominated. And then that's when you get angry. And the late 80s, early 90s, I feel like we're such a mix. Like, I don't think the 80s kind of ended till like 92. So you've got this, I think, a little mini rebellion of films in the early 90s where it's all dark and it's all heavy, like Unforgiven. These are the kind of films that you have to be in the mood they're heavy to sit down to watch. And I don't know.
Good movies though, Unforgiven, and I am not into Westerns. That is a great movie.
For some reason love Dances with Wolves, you're still sitting there like, this movie won over Goodfellas.
But it was but at the time, it was the height of political correctness, and it was all about the Native Americans and people feeling really good about showing that, and a white savior movie.
Mm-hmm.
But I absolutely agree. I mean, Goodfellas is literally tied for my number one favorite movie of all time. It is a perfect film. And not only did it not win Best Picture or Best Director, it also didn't win Best Editing. On what planet? And how was Ray Liotta not nominated? Yet Jeremy Irons won for Reversal of Fortune, which is about a lawyer who nowadays is an awful human being. Like, what?
I forget what it was expressly called, but it was like one of those Blockbuster entertainment guides or something. It was this little blue book that I had as a kid, and it ended at 1990 because that's when I guess it came out. And it was so funny how I thought like it was the dividing line for me. Like, here's all these old movies that were nominated and won, and then you're like, oh my God, okay, here's Goodfellas, here's like The Slight, because here's now these new edgy films that are coming along that they're not nominating. Zita, did we have you said
I want to hear Zita's entire list.
Oh God. Okay.
I do. I want to hear it.
So my thing was, and I was struggling to put this together. For some reason, it sort of started in the 50s for me. Before that, I struggled to get really worked up, even about the bad films that won things.
Mm-hmm.
So I have said this on multiple occasions on this podcast. The 50s are probably my least favorite decade of cinema. Obviously, there were plenty of masterpieces that came out during this period, but for every All About Eve, you have about 50 Quo Vadises. And if
that was going to be one of mine. Okay, yes. I'm going to shut up now.
Quo Vadis, it sucks. It's awful. It represents everything that was bad about big studio filmmaking during this period. It's a slavery apologia that implies that slaves just love being ordered around and belittled and demeaned and ultimately fall in love with their slaveholders. And oh, isn't that romantic? The main romance in this film centers around a Roman centurion who threatens to rape his love interest, who is a slave, when she expresses some hesitance about them getting involved. We cut to another scene. Suddenly they're in love. Outside of the problematic politics, it's also just dull. Peter Ustinov is the only one who's bringing any colour or passion or razzle-dazzle to the screen. Poor Deborah Carr is stuck playing a nothing role. It's a
as
real
the slave. And doesn't he actually capture her at some point?
Yes, it's awful. I hate that movie.
Again.
But yeah, and Peter Ustinov is like off the rails crazy in this movie. And you just have to laugh. You just have to laugh.
Again, like we said, we weren't going to talk about winners, but I immediately, like when I was thinking things off the top of my head, I wrote Greatest Show on Earth because I was like, it did not deserve to be Best Picture. Why is it even nominated? And I'm like, oh yeah, okay, scratch that. Around the World in 80 Days. Oh, it won, scratch that. And it's funny, looking back at my notes here, I wrote 54 to 56, ridiculous.
Which is sad because the 50s,
well,
also the 50s really had
some
the best
films.
The best achievement in film ever, all around the world. You've got Fellini, you've got him with La Strada, you have these great epics, and you also have these gritty, smaller films, but are really Marty, for me, still holds the test. Well, Marty could happen on Friday night.
We know how I feel. The Searchers is my favorite movie ever, and to think that it was not
really
or nothing. And I don't know if it's the big musicals over more deserving films or the big epics. I don't know if Hollywood was up itself in the mid 50s because you had 3D crazes and a lot of the remakes of the silent films or something. But it's funny because I also had Seven Brides for Seven Brothers on my list. It's like, okay, yeah, if you're a kid, it's cute and charming. Oh, look, synchronized dance numbers. But I'm like, as a Best Picture nominee, compared to so many things that were probably more deserving.
Yet, and it's obviously, it's so problematic. But I will say this, Martin Scorsese has talked about that film and like how influential that movie was. And sometimes when Marty talks about things like that, I'm like, that movie? Marty, like, come on.
They used to use that as the widescreen example when they were talking
the widescreen, and that's the thing. I think it was a technical achievement more than like, wow, what a great movie. Because you also have some like Get Hot. You've got all the Billy Wilder films. You've got some of the best Hitchcock films in that decade.
Style Them for Murder and Rear Window, and you think out of the 5 films of 1954, there's no Hitchcock nominee that year. But it doesn't make sense.
It's insane.
Yes. And I also think, just looking at a lot of these nominees, you have so many adaptations of acclaimed plays that I feel do not reach their full potential. Something like Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, for example.
Was that on your list?
Not quite, but it's a very famous play. It has a lot of name recognition. People know who Elizabeth Taylor and Paul Newman are. But the film itself, which was advertised as this sexy, scandalous night at the cinema at the time, just fails to generate sparks nowadays. And I would say to anyone who plans on watching a sexy, scandalous 50s movie, throw on Baby Doll. That is a much better film, and it's far more exciting, I would say.
I would agree with you. I don't think Cat on a Hot Tin Roof is a great movie. I will say, if you're in the mood for some eye candy and you want to look at two beautiful people, Elizabeth Taylor has never looked more beautiful or more sensual. And Paul Newman, woo!
But now Zita and I also talked about The Long Hot Summer for her Passions podcast as well. I mean, shirtless Paul Newman in the 50s. I mean, come on.
And that was part of the 50s though, is because you had such repression and sexuality that you needed to go to the movies to see a hot guy with a shirt off. Look at my beloved William Holden. He's shirtless in like everything he's in, and there's a reason for that.
But the thing is, I think there are mainstream, financially successful 50s movies that reflect that sexual repression in a far more interesting manner. Again, going back to Baby Doll, that is a film that features some of the horniest characters who have ever appeared on screen. Even French movies that feature people walking around nude for the entire running time are not as sexually charged as this film. It's crazy that it got made and released in 1956, and it pisses me off that couldn't get nominated. If something like Picnic, which is a film that wants to be sexy and taboo busting, but is so meek about it and so afraid of offending anybody, Baby Doll just seems light years ahead of that film in terms of its approach to the subject matter.
It does,
even though they can come out 1 year apart.
But call me shallow, but there's also less eye candy. I mean, do you want to look at William Holden and Paul Newman, or do we want to look at Eli Wallach and Carl Malden?
In that
and with
movie,
all due respect to Carl Malden, Carl, I love you. You're brilliant. And should have gotten more than one Academy Award. Hello, why did he not win for On the Waterfront? But anyway. But yeah, when I put on Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, it's because I want to look at beautiful people, because I'm shallow. And it's hard because, especially with Tennessee Williams, you had to not mention the fact that Brick and Skipper had feelings for each other.
But can we just say the irony here that our biggest complaints out the gate are the 80s and the 50s, which is so like Reagan conservative, kind of times where, oh no, we couldn't have the taboo, films pushing the envelope. We have to have, all these safe, films for the whole family.
But Peyton Place was almost on my list, because as scandalous as that movie was, the book, audience members, read the book. It's a great read. The book is 50 billion times more screwed up.
Well, again, the sociology of having the way we're looking at these films, either reflective of what was going on at the time or completely, blind eye to what was happening. And I've said before, like the saucy Victorian literature compared to the chastity of the Forbidden Ankle, and the way, like From Here to Eternity, a lot of the books and the plays in the 50s are pretty tawdry and pretty juicy. But then when there's a film adaptation, it's so safe. It's colorful, it's beautiful, but it's safe. And to me, I don't know, again, a best picture should not be safe.
For the times, but I think for the times, the fact that this was a woman, if we're going back to From Here to Eternity, which I do not believe is a bad nominee. I think it's one of the best winners that we had. But there's a lot of stuff in the book that I'm not even sure would get put in today, because in general, it had to be seductive. But I remember the scene where the Burt Lancaster character meets the Deborah Carr character. In the book, he basically tells her, like, upon talking to her, like, I really want to fuck you right now. I mean, it's very
and
blunt.
We're gonna get bleeped now.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry, JD.
I was quoting literature, JD.
Well, again, look at the way these eras come back. The 50s were so great. Well, for whom? Not for everybody. We're back into this weird wave again.
But then I think moving on. Sorry, other best picture nominees that I dislike.
Yes.
Also sort of come up. So for me, movies like My Fair Lady, Dr. Zhivago, The Sand Pebbles, and Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, The Lion in Winter, to really reflect what I dislike about this period of Academy history. On the one hand, you have these movies like Darling and Midnight Cowboy that do seem more progressive, that are films that are trying to push cinema forward as a narrative medium in some way. And then at the same time, you do have these old-fashioned productions that they kept falling back on. And I know there are people out there who love David Lean's Dr. Zhivago. I think it's so empty and lacking in substance and facile, and we overuse the term pretentious. And I understand that it has lost some of its meaning over time. But Dr. Zhivago, wow, it really earns that pejorative.
How dare you, madam?
No, but
I love Dr. Zhivago. It's one of those movies that I love, but I also totally understand when people are like, wow, that's a really long, boring movie. Mm. I get it. I couldn't finish the book. That's a comfort movie for me. I can see why it was nominated for Best Picture, though, because technically it is a gorgeous film. And I will also say, for me, I thought the one actor I think really who should have been nominated was Rod Steiger, because I feel like his character was extremely complicated and a bad guy, but he also tended to be right all the time. But interesting lists.
Well, I agree with Zita, because Amy and I both, before we started, both said Hello Dolly, which I like a lot of Hello Dolly.
It's cute.
But it's 1969, and you can clearly see that this movie is 10 years too late. And even though they begin nominating some of these things that are provocative and have multi-dimension, and they still go back on all these musicals. And it's so funny, I don't think of the late 60s as the heyday of musicals. But yet, there's so many of them that are nominated. Of course, Oliver, we could have a debate.
Especially Oliver in 1968. 1968, which I have covered in 2 different podcasts. To put in perspective, Oliver wins Best Picture. Movies that came out that year that were not nominated: 2001: A Space Odyssey, one of the most groundbreaking movies ever. Not a favorite, but it should have been nominated for Best Picture. Rosemary's Baby came out that year. Ignored. The Producers, Mel Brooks. Like, great films that were new voices, just totally ignored.
And I like Beckett. I like The Lion in Winter, but again, these big medieval epics. It's he said is what was the word you said? The P word, Zita? Pretentious. I would almost say pompous. It's a lot of these films sometimes. And so even when I like them, Anne of 1,000 Days, I like, but it's like, They're too windblown. Are they worth a Best Picture nomination? No. Hello, Dolly. There's so many scenes that are just really long dance numbers that just go on, and you're like,
they're a little boring.
It should have been 90 minutes.
Tight 90.
So Zita, that was, you had your complaints about the late 60s. Did you say you had complaints about the early 70s?
No, I think that the 70s were a relatively strong period for the Academy. Obviously, we look back on this as one of the richest periods culturally in terms of the history of American cinema. And you could say that they don't fully reflect just how groundbreaking a lot of these films were. And you still get the occasional stodgy biopic in there, but still, on the whole, it's pretty solid. I don't mind the 80s, unlike the rest of you. And then I think the 2000s, oof. I know I said the 50s were my least favorite decade of cinema, but the 2000s are just dull. They honestly,
Rough.
they don't even register in my mind as an important decade of cinema. There are a couple of films from that period that I love. Obviously, I'm wildly overgeneralizing here, but I look at some of these years, like 2008, I look at that lineup. None of those films inspire strong feelings in me. Yes, the reader is gross, Nazi justification child porn. Well, he's not a child, but it's a movie that tries
He's 15.
to justify,
He's a schoolboy.
It tries to justify both pedophilia and being a Nazi, but she's sad because she can't read, so feel
And that's
bad.
her deep dark secret.
Yes, that's her redemption. But you look at that lineup, and even the films that are nominated that aren't that flagrantly offensive are just sort of I just feel nothing towards them. I don't think that they've left a long-lasting cultural legacy. Slumdog Millionaire, I understand, has become rather controversial for its treatment of Indian culture. I just feel dispassionate about so many of these films.
Yeah.
That is a strange year, and it bothers me that Danny Boyle, that's his win, when Train Spotting, which came out in the 90s, is so much more interesting. Getting back, I've one from the late 60s I'd like to mention. Dr. Dolittle in 1967 came out, audience members who don't have this memorized, in the heat of the night, which absolutely could take place today. Do we agree on that? In the heat of the night?
No.
Still hits.
No.
Except, can we also say this, that the Sidney Poitier character probably would have been beaten to death in the first 5 minutes of the movie?
I think that's the thing. It feels like a liberal wish fulfillment fantasy that exists to make white people feel more secure in themselves.
See, I personally don't feel that way. I feel like it makes white people look really freaking stupid. I think an alternate title should be called Stupid White People.
This stuff comes back again. I mean, the sociology of it. I mean, 67 in the heat of the night. I'm sorry, I was watching LA Confidential again the other day.
I love that movie.
Hold up your badge so they know you're a policeman, when you're in these gang beating shootouts. And then we're back again. We're back in this era again. So sometimes the winners, hit it right, but then you're some of these other films that you're saying Dr. Dolittle in comparison is no.
And The Graduate and Bonnie and Clyde. Groundbreaking. Guess Who's Coming to Dinner? That would be on my list of why was this movie not. And I get why it was nominated, but that's such a barfy fringe fest.
I said, how are we going to divvy this up? And we said, well, we'll just talk about, the things that we hate the most. Because when I started looking at this by decade, I said, yeah, the 30s are a hot mess. The 40s and the 70s, I actually kind of wrote, overall, they're really pretty good. And you think about they were really much more turbulent times, war and issues happening where people were able to recognize, I guess here's when the great films come along. And then you have the 50s. I don't know what they were trying to do, trying to pump themselves up, with reinventing Hollywood. The 60s get kind of split in the changing times. The 80s is more worried about, I don't know, conservative
nostalgia.
And I had 2008. I just had like 2008 exclamation question mark. Like, what the heck happened?
Was that the Slumdog Millionaire year?
Yeah. Like
I would.
The early aughts to me is when I was old enough that I began, having argument and disagreeing with it. And then by the 2010s, I just completely checked out. I'm like, I just can't even be bothered with these Oscars. They're just so infuriating to me anymore.
Well, even 2000 Gladiator is such Gladiator is a 1950s movie. And then you had Traffic, which is Aaron Brockovich.
2000, 2001, I have problems because I've said this before. The Searchers is my favorite movie ever, but I sit back and I will always defend Memento. And you just think, how was that like so ignored? In this year, when was Gosford Park more worthy of Best Picture and script nominations than Memento? No,
weren't those were separate years.
I know, but it's like,
and then you have, and I'm gonna get slack here, the year that Titanic comes out.
Don't start.
You have Good Will Hunting, an okay film. I'm sorry, it's an okay film. But it winning best screenplay over Boogie Nights. What?
We've spent time arguing about Titanic. Please, I argue about Titanic every day.
I'm not even mentioning Titanic because I do understand the Titanic. Like, I hate the movie Avatar with the fiery passions of 1,000 suns. Do I understand why it was nominated? I do. I do understand that it's this technical marvel.
Ugh. Zita, you posted on Twitter too, people asking people what like their favorite films of the 90s were. And I was going through that list and only one person said LA Confidential, but dozens.
It was you.
No, it was not.
Under a fake Twitter.
Dozens of people said Titanic. And I'm just like, Urgh. And to me, it's really infuriating. Like, it's not nearly as important as a film, but I had written down on here somewhere, Love Story. It's 70 or 70.
Yes.
Where it's like, it becomes indicative of the entire 70s as being so sappy, lovey-dovey. Love means never having to say you're sorry.
Which means nothing.
And the way Titanic just apparently becomes so indicative of the 90s. And I'm like, hold on a second. Hold on. No. Ugh.
One of the things that I love about the incredibly stupid opening of Love Story is just how aggressively generic his description of his wife is. This is a woman that he is meant to have loved deeply. The things we learn about her, she loved the Beatles. You think, wow, most 20-something American woman in 1970 probably loved the Beatles. I don't think that was all that rare or uncommon. She is truly...
It's like saying she really loved Christmas.
Yes.
I was thinking of the Golden Girls where Rose is talking about Charlie.
Yes.
One of a kind, loves Christmas.
And Dorothy's like,
yeah,
that's a rarity. And she was beautiful. And she also liked Beethoven. You're right, because no one who's a music major is into classical music. Like, what? She also was kind of a bitch. Can we say that about that character? She's kind of a bitch.
And the amount of times, this is mean, but the amount of times that Eddie McGraw crinkles her nose in what is meant to be an adorable gesture got on my nerves.
She's not, and Ryan O'Neal, and everyone thinks, oh, Barry Lyndon, that's Kubrick's masterpiece. I'm like, but is Ryan O'Neal in it? And he's terrible. He's awful. He wrecked that movie. I hate Ryan O'Neal.
I think it's one of the greatest movies ever made. But
Love Story?
No, Barry Lyndon.
Even
Woo.
with Ryan O'Neal?
Yes, I think its strengths are great enough to overcome that performance. I know there are people who argue that the badness is a feature and not a defect. I can't quite bring myself to believe that, oh, it was all deliberate on Kubrick's part and he wanted to coax this emotionally shallow performance out of the lead actor. However, I would say that everything that surrounds O'Neill is so stunning that you don't find yourself thinking about it.
I was obsessed with it, but but I could see why it was nominated for Best Picture. I'm not saying it didn't deserve it, but Love Story was a huge movie that year, and I understand that, but wow, that's a terrible movie.
Yes, you contrast it with something like Five Easy Pieces, which is so much more complex, has so much more to say about the social climate of the period, and you think, really? We're settling for this?
And yet lost to Patton. Five Easy Pieces lost to Patton, which is a very traditional film.
And
that baffles me. But my movies from the 80s, hold on, I just want to finish up my schlock list. On Golden Pond, I cannot. I just cannot with that movie. The Big Chill and Places in the Heart, which is a Hallmark movie with A-list actors. That's my schlock. My 90s was Chocolat. Cute movie. Enjoy watching it. Why? This is such a nothing movie. If Harvey Weinstein didn't exist, that movie would not have been nominated. The Blind Side from 2010. That was a big suckfest too. And that's another Hallmark movie. White savior Hallmark movie. And it saddens me because I have a lot of female friends who think that movie is like it. They cried during this movie. It moved them. It made them say, oh, it makes me want to look at my world more closely. The fact that they make him stupid really bothers me. And that little boy, every time he's on the screen, I wanted to punch him in the face. Like I wanted like a big anvil to fall on his head when he was walking down the street. He was not cute. He was not cute.
2004, I had questions about as well, because I was like Finding Neverland. Like, I think when I saw it, I was like, well, I guess this is cute. Maybe this seems kind of whimsical. But then you think about it, you think the more you know about J.M. Barrie, you're like, this is kind of creepy. This is a little too creepy to be praised.
I liked it when I saw it, but I agree with you. But again, so many, really?
I don't know. That whole window, I don't know, from like Shakespeare in Love. I mean, not to get religious, Titanic, you're supposed to turn the other cheek. And it's like you go from like English Patient, Titanic, Shakespeare in Love. That's when I really got kind of angry at a lot of these things. Memento not getting nominated. And then you're like, oh, okay, yes, okay, Return of the King. And then you get like, oh, okay, Crash. So it was like the whiplash from some of these winners in the aughts was just like, and then you just see the I don't know, the litter that's nominated. And again, you think these were the years where there was only 5, and you're like, there's so few things being nominated, and you're like, but a lot of these films did not stand the test of time. And again, what was happening sociologically, I don't know, like the irony, like you said, how everybody loving Patton, but then you get Saving Private Ryan not winning, and so there was this, I don't know, reverse nostalgia at the time when the 90s was doing the 70s. And then I don't know if there was some kind of change after 9/11 where it was back to, I don't know, we're going to nominate these heavy films again, and you look at them and you're like, these are not entertaining films. These are not films that you would watch over and over again. Master and Commander, I don't know.
Yeah, and I think
I do not get through. I do not do Holocaust movies at all. Like,
the last year that really was great and nominated new different voices was like 1994, which Forrest Gump gets a lot of slack. But when that movie came out, I really liked it. It was interesting. I'm not going to dump on it. I don't know if it should have won, but it is a good movie. Pulp Fiction nominated for Best Picture.
I love Quiz Show.
Oh, I love Quiz Show. It's one of my top 100.
Film that I think was ahead of its time, and as we said, how Hollywood loves to pat itself on the back. The biopics, or when it's commentating about itself, they nominate. When you've got a film that's sort of shining the lens negatively on, the 50s quiz scandals, television, all of a sudden it's like, well, okay, we can't not acknowledge this because Robert Redford is behind it. But you're right. The Weinstein shit coming on, it was like you started to see the politics of the Academy.
And it was more people need to see that. But then in the Shawshank Redemption, that movie hits everyone I've never met a person who, when you mention the Shawshank Redemption, if they've seen it, that does not consider it one of their favorite movies, because there's something so universal about that film. But you also had, now Heavenly Creatures was not nominated for Best Picture, but I think it was nominated for director or screenplay. Mm-hmm. But again, Peter Jackson's first real major film. So you had a lot of seriously interesting films from very interesting filmmakers who would then go on to continue to make.
Wins adapted screenplay. This is when I started. Okay, the Best Picture winner is not the true Best Picture winner. Let's look at the screenplay. And you could get really technical with these. I've always been baffled of how is the Best Picture winner when it's also not the Best Director winner, because wouldn't the Best Director have directed the Best Picture?
I realized the difference, and I think now Best Director is like James Cameron and I know he didn't win for Avatar, but just like he would win because it's technical. I feel like directing now seems to be more about the technical aspects, but the movie, you don't necessarily need that to be a great movie.
Zita.
Mm-hmm. Yes. My thoughts on it are that I think it's a fascinating quirk that the Academy has, and more recently we have seen direct-to-picture splits. And I sort of like it as a trend. I think it at least makes the ceremony more exciting, where you don't think, oh, well, the director of the Best Picture winner is automatically going to win. It's up in the air sometimes. And I also think it's fair to say that you can have a great film that doesn't necessarily stand out for its direction. And there are cases where you have a movie that doesn't come together fully, that still features some very impressive direction. And part of the fascination of these awards is trying to break up a movie into different segments and attempting to evaluate them on their own terms, which often proves to be impossible. Of course it is. It's completely subjective. But that question of, well, how do you separate these things from one another? Why did she win Best Supporting Actress? Oh, it was because they knew that her film wouldn't win anything else. They still wanted to give the movie something. The political nature of it is often what ends up being the most fascinating element of these awards. And I know most people say that as, oh, isn't it awful? It's horrible that they're demeaning art in this way, and they should aim to have more integrity. And in certain regards, I completely agree with that. I think the Oscars So White campaign is very important. They should make efforts to introduce more diversity. I kind of don't mind the fact that they're so tacky and corrupt in many regards. I just think that's part of the whole deal. And I think they're always going to be that way.
I like how you put it politely first. Oh, the Oscars are subjective, but then you ended with tacky and corruption, which pretty much across the board, when something is tacky and something's corrupt, everyone pretty much agrees. 2011 is another one that I just had the whole year marked on my question mark, like WTF.
What movies for that year?
I'll tell you. The Artist is the winner.
Oh,
as I said, Hollywood loves to reward itself, which again is not stood the test of time as winning for picture, director, actor too.
Yeah.
Like again, and the way Zita said, like they want to have their cake and eat it too. How they want to do prestige. These are big tentpole drama pieces, but then they will also award technical achievement. But yet they won't go so far to award a technical achievement. It's rare for them to award genre. So it's like they want to play it both ways. And here it's like, oh, look how technically special. It's silent and it's black and white. Let's give it all the awards. But does that, because of these things, does that make it the best movie? Not necessarily. The other nominees were The Descendants, Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close.
Oh,
Excuse
me.
The Help, okay, Hugo, Midnight in Paris, Moneyball, The Tree of Life, and War Horse.
None of those movies are really that good. When I did my article on that year now it used to be, how was this movie even nominated? But then it changed to, how was this great film not nominated? But Extremely Close and Extremely Loud, whatever the title is, that was my pick for on what planet was this movie nominated for Best Picture. It is so awful. And the kid in that movie was the least likable child I have ever seen on film. Ever.
I mean, when you look at
quote me on that.
Like Midnight in Paris, I think wins a screenplay. And I wrote about this one for InSession too. It's like, it's so nostalgic and sentimental that it's safe, but that doesn't mean that it's a good movie. And again, I'm not an Alan fan, and it's like this rewarding something just because you should, even though the whole point of the movie is saying, don't, over sentimentalize the past, that going back in time into the past was better. And you're like, but you're awarding that, you're celebrating that. Zita?
I think it's one of those examples of the Academy having a favorite. And in this case, Woody Allen, very controversial. I think he's probably an awful person based on what I've read about what he has done. I do think it is gross to begin a relationship with someone who was your adopted daughter. It's very creepy looking at pictures of them posing for family photos together when she's 12 and he's
107.
And then to celebrate this,
anyway,
on the nostalgia glasses and award this, it's just
no, I don't think that's necessary. What I was trying to get at is that I think it's an example of them having a favorite, in this case Allen, and you do notice that even his weaker films in the 90s and 2000s will still get a screenplay nomination. And Midnight in Paris, I think it's fine. I don't hate it. I think the real problem that it faces is that it has one major theme and it overstates that theme significantly. Multiple characters have to spell it out loud for Owen Wilson. There are supporting female characters who are not especially well developed, especially, I used the word especially twice in too close a proximity, but Rachel McAdams' bitchy fiance is so underwritten, and you can imagine a 70s or 80s Ellen film in which that character has far more depth and isn't just an unpleasant churl who exists to make Owen Wilson's life miserable, and they're cheating on one another for reasons that are never really explained. Anyway, it lacks the depth of his previous work. It's reminiscent of a lot of better films that he's made. And I do think during this period, especially on the part of critics, there is this desperate desire to believe that he's back, baby, and he's back on form. He's regained the magic that permeated his 70s and 80s golden age work. And I think looking back now, especially after having watched movies like A Rainy Day in New York, which might be one of his worst, we can fully accept the fact that the Annan of the 2010s was not on top form. He is very much an artist in decline in terms of the quality of his work. And I think that the raves that greeted that film, they were being a little bit over the top, you could say.
Stop trying to make fetch happen.
Yes.
It's like,
yes.
coming from a writing background, you look at the movie and you think, how did that win screenplay? Like, it's so superficial. You're saying the past isn't as good as you think it is, but then you're looking at this going, the star power, you're like, the past scenes are better. All the contemporary scenes are the problem. And there's like, Owen Wilson is basically playing Woody Allen. And it's just like, and what Amy had said earlier, when they expanded the window of nominees, you're like, why did they bother?
Yeah, the movie, and I feel like I felt that way. You said The Descendants came out that year. Another one, two George Clooney films that I'm like, this was honestly nominated for Best Picture. The Descendants and Up in the Air. Up in the Air, to me, is a completely generic film. It's trying very hard to push you to feel something, yet, and you're supposed to feel bad for him at the end of Up in the Air.
It's supposed to be an emotional
You're supposed to, and at the end of The Descendants, you're also supposed to feel sorry for him. And you're like, because again, he's kind of a jerk. He doesn't really connect with people. Both movies, he literally plays the same character. He doesn't really connect with people. He tenuously tries to connect with someone, and then it doesn't work out, and then he's sad. Like, what? It's such a nothing movie that, yeah, if they still had five, neither one of those, and that stupid, extremely loud and extremely close or whatever, that was
what
awful.
Year is Up in the Air? Up in the Air. What year is that?
2009.
2009. Okay.
And not only that, and again, that they're getting these nominees the year that Spotlight came out. Spotlight, again, is an important film, but is it actually a good movie?
Mm-hmm.
Or is it just an important film that brought to light a lot of really interesting, important ideas? But is it like a great movie? I don't know.
But it's ironic because we're on the decline at this point of the star power, name recognition, maybe carrying a movie or something. And yet it seems like people are being awarded just for the names. We had the Clooney movie. Oh, we had the Tom Hanks movie. You know, we had the Woody Allen movie. We have the Spielberg movie. We have the Brad Pitt movie. Like, it seems like it's coasting at this point. This is when I really began to get really infuriated, because I was liking things like, we should do a separate thing about whatever happened to Michael Fassbender, because I mentioned it before, because to me, you had these great independent films like Hunger and Fish Tank that were just on the outside looking in. And I began looking at this of like, at this point, I became firmly of the Oscars are not indicative of the best films that are available. And I've stopped actively following, and I've never looked back. I've sent you guys the gifts lots of times of like you guys getting so infuriated over awards, and I'm like, I'm here to live my best life. I don't care. You know, which today is like, oh, you know, scandal, a film critic who doesn't care about awards. But it's like I just don't think they're representative. I mean, 12 Years a Slave, when 12 Years a Slave wins, I thought that was deserving, but that was really, you know, I was like, yeah, I checked out at that point. Again, 2014, I was like the you know, the Rovers ignored, forget you.
I feel that 12 Years a Slave was a very safe pick that year. It personally would not have been my best film of that year. I think The Wolf of Wall Street is one of Martin Scorsese's greatest films. And I feel like people completely missed the point, because they said, oh, it glorifies the lifestyle of basically a villain. My take on that is, if you watch that movie and you want to be like those guys, that says a lot more about you than about what Scorsese. I don't think Scorsese is glorifying it. I think those people were disgusting, and he's showing all of the, like, would you really want to be him after watching this movie? Like, having to get a penicillin shot because he's having sex with so many hookers? Like, that's what you want, you know? And
the whole separate argument, because you could say, what, in 1988, when you were getting Wall Street, greed is good, where everybody was wanting to be the yuppie, and everything was wanting to be about greed and stock exchange and everything glorious. But again, 2013, it's like, is it Gravity and Captain Phillips, like, still kind of coasting in on Hanks and Bullock, and yeah.
Well, to compare Wall Street to The Wolf of Wall Street, I think that Martin Scorsese as a filmmaker is leagues ahead of Oliver Stone in terms of the sophistication of his films, in terms of his ability to convey a message somewhat subtly. He doesn't necessarily feel the need to spoon feed it to you, even though you wouldn't describe The Wolf of Wall Street as a subtle film in a conventional sense. My problem with Oliver Stone's Wall Street is that it's so childishly naive. Essentially, it is the story of Faust repackaged for the 80s. And as with so many of Stone's films, it's essentially rooted in a conservative mindset, even though he wants to be seen as this liberal firebrand. One of my big points of frustration with it is that it's a movie that is nostalgic for the old days of capitalism, back when capitalism was great, and it definitely wasn't screwing workers over, because everything was totally fine in the 50s, and back when Martin Sheen was working for the auto industry. No, things were good back then. It wasn't as though there were labor disputes then, and things weren't getting automated. No. It was fine. Whereas the film tries to paint it as though, well, yes, capitalism is fine up to a point, but then it gets corrupted in the 80s.
And
it's stupid, honestly.
No,
the movie
and
has nothing to say.
And Wolf of Wall Street, the hard thing about that is, obviously in Wall Street, the Stone version, you have Michael Douglas, who's clearly supposed to be like the devil. Like, he's clearly the bad guy. This guy's clearly the good guy. And the Wolf of Wall Street, and the brilliance of it is that DiCaprio is at peak DiCaprio. He's so charismatic, and you're watching him, and he's a good-looking guy, and he's funny. He's so funny. And then it hits you in the face with these terrible things that he's doing. So you're like, whoa, wait a minute. That you as an audience member are being pulled along into his story. And you're like, wow, he's a cool guy. He's doing all these things, and he's funny, and he's this and he's that. And then, oh, that's right, though. There is a bad side. And they talk about one of the guys committing, they both had sex with the wife, and then the guy committed suicide. And it's always very like, oh yeah, we did this hot, sexy thing. Later, the husband committed suicide, but blah, 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 blah. And you're like, oh, wait a minute. And then when he is a jerk and he's high and he's on his boat, and and he's laughing about, oh, and I did this insane thing and I was on a boat and blah, blah, blah. So these rescuers had to come rescue me. And one or two of them actually died. But anyway, I was okay. So you have these moments of being slapped in the face with, these are terrible people.
Yes.
And at the end, not only does he go to prison, but he loses his daughter. His wife leaves him because he's a dirtbag. This is not something that you really want to emulate.
I wouldn't say woke, I think, is an over word used. I would say Wolf of Wall Street is very self-aware that this is not good, this is not healthy. Or Wall Street, I feel like it's pretending to be a commentary, shining the light, but it's like, no, this is the reality of the decade, in itself. And it baffles me that I love Charlie Sheen. He was my first
He was good.
He was
great in those Oliver Stone movies.
Yes. And to me, Platoon is Oliver Stone's magnum opus. And then you see all the things that he was continually nominated for after that, yes, they're great films, but you're like, but no, they weren't as good. Nothing will ever be as good as Platoon. And it's just, again, these indicatives of sign of the times, where, I don't know, the divide where you can see how some of these films are really out of touch. Zita?
Well, I also think an important thing to note with The Wolf of Wall Street is that it has this very nihilistic ending, where even though Amy talks about the fact that, yes, his wife and children leave him, he is technically all alone at the end of the film and in prison, but they make the point that it is a rich person prison. And so we see him playing tennis. He's accustomed to this very nice lifestyle. And there's a sense that once he gets out, he will be doing much better financially than the majority of people who work a regular 9-to-5 job and are a part of the middle classes or even the working class. And so he's not punished. Whereas in Wall Street, you have this incredibly idealistic ending where, because Charlie Sheen, this one naive little boy, is able to pick the good daddy, Martin Sheen, over the bad daddy, Michael Douglas, that means that all hope is not lost and we can save ourselves from this corruption. And that's just ridiculous. And we see it today. Very few things have changed since the 80s.
Charlie Sheen, in a way, almost embodies, this is what happens to you when you live it up in the excess.
He was already crazy in the 80s.
Yeah. And the irony is you have Martin Scorsese is getting acclaim in The Wolf of Wall Street saying these things in 2013, and you want to sit back and be like, he already said these things in 1990 in Goodfellas, the whole montage.
But I think it's as good. I think the movie is as good as Goodfellas. I think it's one of his best movies because it takes you on a wild ride. And it is an indictment because, like I said, there's times in the movie where you're laughing and you're like, oh, these guys are crazy. And then you're like, wait a minute. I'm finding him entertaining. I'm kind of an idiot. I'm kind of a jerk too.
Well, look, and we wonder how people become so easily followers to crazy things that are happening in our society now. And then you're like, well, yeah, people are very easily blinded and led. I don't know.
And the fact that DiCaprio did not win his Oscar for that movie is
that, I think,
it needs to be like at The Hague if we need to try.
Another thing at this point is when you really start getting angry of makeup Oscars, or people keep getting nominated and not awarded, and it's just to me it's not entertaining. To me, I lose interest when it becomes Oscars begin getting so many things wrong more than they're getting things right. And I wrote that down on our topics because I said, how do we break this down? I just said, Oscar mistakes by decade alone. I mean, it's just a huge topic we could keep discussing. Amy, did you have any other years hated nominees?
No, but now I'm thinking that Dallas Buyers Club also was not one of the best nominees of all time. Good performance. And I think it's really interesting that if you watch Matthew McConaughey in The Wolf of Wall Street, in that one scene that he's in, all I think about when I see that is I know that Dallas Buyers Club came out that same year, and McConaughey is a stick. He's very, very skinny and he's wearing a lot of makeup. And I'm like, oh, because he just got done doing the AIDS movie.
The reconnaissance. We start talking about the things that we absolutely hate. And then you get into adamantly defending like your favorites and the things that you love. Zita, did you have any more on your list?
Oh, no, I think I've covered the main targets of my ire. I guess one last one that I'd like to address is the King's Speech, which is incredibly frustrating to watch if you are an anti-monarchist, anti-royalist like myself. It's this movie that expects you to be in thrall to the British royal family. Horrifying politics. It's historically inaccurate, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but in this case it is frustrating because the real story would be far more interesting than what we get. This ridiculous piece of royalist kitsch that suggests that this one posh, overprivileged man who should not be given a position of power, giving a couple of speeches was really significant. And of course, he contributed more to the war effort than all of those lower class boys who died out on the battlefield. Actually, it was King George who was going through the real struggle.
I've said that before. Everybody hates that one. I don't hate it as a film, but to me, it's like, again, one of these, oh, it's a period piece, a biopic, British loved, name recognition. It's like, of course it was going to get nominated, of course it was going to win things. And, you bring it up because I have to say it, because I'm sorry, Guy Pearce is playing Edward the Seventh.
He was hot in the movie.
And it's like, you're looking at this movie and they give him a couple speeches, a couple scenes with Wallace Simpson, and you're kind of like, it completely ignores the Nazi element of it. They truly focus on this. Oh no, he's really only giving it up for love. And you're like, bull, you're like, could we have seen that?
He's not really giving it up.
We have seen that movie, please.
Yeah, we don't really know that at the same time he's talking to Germans about getting his power back.
Mm-hmm.
No, I despise the film. It's horrifying in terms of its class politics. I think its real problem is that I honestly believe it's a movie that is more disgusted by the fact that Wallace Simpson might have had dangerous sexual skills. That is a specific scene that we focus on, where the ladies who are a member of upper crust society are talking about her history as this loose woman who has had many lovers, and we're meant to think, oh, but isn't that just dreadful? Helena Bonham Carter, the Queen Mother, would never stoop so low. She would never do something that immoral. And I honestly believe that it expects us to be more grossed out and disgusted by that than by their association with Nazis or by the fact that they're both classist snobs, because the people who wrote this movie were probably classist snobs themselves.
Or, was approved or something by the family at the time or something. I don't know. But
Which is how you know it's bad.
The old Merchant Ivory. Yeah. The old Merchant Ivory. They've officially sanctioned Helena Bonham Carter. Oh, okay, awards are going to follow.
No, Merchant Ivory is very different, though, because they make films that are class critiques. And Merchant Ivory spin-off here. You watch Howard's End, and the whole point of Helena Bonham Carter's character in that film is that she's sort of an irritating champagne socialist who has these liberal ideals that she cannot stick to, because at the end of the day, she is still an aristocrat. And even though she might want to sleep with lower class boys, she does not want to commit to them at the end of the day, and is very much committed to living this life of privilege.
I love A Room with a View, of course. And again, as a kid in the 80s, and shout out poor Julian Sands, but it was like these films were so long and so annoying. And I'm like, why are they here? And then you come along some of these films that are nominated for Worthy. And I'm like, oh, this is so pretty. This is so beautiful.
Oh, I love Howard's End.
No, I was saying A Room with a View too.
Yes.
It's like,
oh, well, you've not just Julian Sands, you've got Rupert Graves in that movie. And I could do an entire podcast episode on why Rupert Graves is on my short list to be my next husband.
And The King's Speech was a winner, though, Zita. See, that doesn't count. We're only talking about nominees.
Oh. Okay, well, but it's still dreadful.
You're agreeing with all my problems of here's a prestige film, it's a biopic, here it's automatically elevated, and you're like, by 2010 you expect the Academy to know better. Then you're like, and again, as a writer overall, as an adaptation of a biography book, it is flawed, and I feel like the pace is meant to mirror the stuttering and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, because like the scenes where he is talking to like Guy Pearce in the wine cellar when he's going to get more wine, the king is going down in the wine cellar himself to go get wine for Wallace Simpson because he loves her so much, and you know, they're trying to talk about the Nazis and he's just blowing them off, and it's happening very fast, and then that's when he's mocking his stuttering, and then you get the big sweeping like Beethoven like speech composition at the end as the crowning achievement, and it's very, I see what you did there. I can't hate it because I like the people in it, but I'm like, but again, I see what you're doing, and that doesn't mean you're the best picture, you know. And again, this is 2010. This is when my infuriation with the awards season, you know, was just, you know, peaking here. So I don't love the awards. Do I dare ask if you ladies have feelings about the current awards season?
My heart, my soul, the every essence of my being is behind the movie The Banshees of Inisherin. I am madly in love with that movie and every single part of it. And I want it to. It's not, is it going to? My guess is probably not, but I don't care. I love it. I think it's perfect and amazing, and I love it.
Zita?
I'm hoping that Tar wins everything. That's my favorite film of the past year.
Did you have any final thoughts about our most hated nominees? We tried to narrow it down, but it's our hatred just comes through.
I've really enjoyed this chat. I think Amy's observations have been as spicy as ever, and so that's been very enjoyable to listen to.
Yeah, I'm taking you at face value because I was like, she being sarcastic right now?
No, we start out being so polite and
Yes.
so succinct and giving our reasons, and then we just boil down to cursing at the stupidity of some of these films.
Well, I've said it before and I'm going to say it again. The one thing I love about Zita is that I'm a very opinionated person, and it takes a lot for me to really step back and rethink my opinions. And Zita's one of the few people that can make me do that, because even if I still love the movie A Place in the Sun, everything that Zita says about it is actually very valid and well thought out and well argued. And I love that.
I think a great film should be able to give both.
Yeah.
And you see some of these terrible nominees that are just so forgettable that, as I said, if you don't recognize it by its name, then it can't have been that memorable, that worthy of a film. Zita?
Well, thank you so much, Amy. That's such a kind thing for you to say, and the same absolutely goes for you. And I guess I agree with what Kristin said. It's most frustrating to encounter a film that doesn't inspire anything in you, no emotional response, that inspires pure boredom, you could say. And at least you could point out something like Hello, Dolly is memorably atrocious in its way.
Yeah. And there's some good numbers in it. You know what I mean? In some movies I accept, but at least they're fun and at least they're partly entertaining. But yeah.
There are times in the faintness of the other end of the room while I'll hear some of the songs from Hello, Dolly, and I'll do the echo down into my husband, and I'll say, are you watching WALL-E again?
Yep. Put on your Sunday clothes. It's a catchy song. Mm-hmm. It is a catchy song.
Mm-hmm. Amy, you've written about some of these love-hate things at InSession.
I have. The How Is It Not nominated? I don't remember the last one I did because then I paused. But yeah, how was this nominated or how was this not nominated? But
Zita, did you write about a few of these for the 300 Passions?
Yes, there have been a couple of Best Picture nominees on that list. Picnic, in particular, I discussed in all of its irritating banality.
Banal. That's, again, a whole separate issue. That's what we could say today. I don't care for a film that's just banal. You know, I want a film that's going to shatter who I am as a person and change my life. Just like when you read a book, I've said this. I feel like when you read a book, you're changed by the time you get to the end. And I expect great films to do the same thing, to change who you are. That's why I love my favorites, because some films just completely, blow you over like a feather. So Amy, you're at A. Thomasson 11.
Yes.
We can see your awards complaints forthcoming. So we still have classic discourse that we're going to toss in every now and again. And we'll be talking about more Oscar things, some of the winners, some of our actors beloved and anger, I suppose, depending on how the cards fall after the Oscars. And there's plenty of awards things happening at In Session Film. You can see the flagship podcast. You can listen. They're on YouTube. They're on Patreon. All the Chasing the Gold things are going to be going crazy, I'm sure. We've got a few ladies are at some festivals and some award shows. Erica, Shadon, they're off on Hollywood adventures, I suppose, South by Southwest. So, but lots of new things happening, and we're going to throw in classic things as well. Zita, you're at the 300 Passions podcast and at Zita_short.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
What was the last thing you did at In Session?
Oh, well, at the moment, I'm chatting with a Swedish guest, Marcus, about the film Romancing the Stone, which I believe you two are fans of.
Yes.
And so let's talk about Kathleen Turner as a romance novelist and Michael Douglas's very strange career where he doesn't get to be a movie star until he's relatively old. So that's sort of fun to get into. And then, of course, the influence of the African Queen.
Oh.
And they have such crackling chemistry.
I just submitted, I don't know when you'll see it again because all awards things are happening, but I just submitted a blurb about the War of the Roses, which it's like, oh, Kathleen Turner and Michael Douglas get a divorce. Hot AF. Yeah, they just don't make them like they used to anymore.
And Danny DeVito was great in that movie. Was that nominated for Best Picture?
War of the Roses?
No, the Romancing the Stone?
No.
It had, I think,
it wasn't
script or screenplay nominations.
No.
Woman
I
died.
don't think so.
Did she?
No, I don't think it was an award success because they're very against light comedy.
Yeah, the frustration of the 80s, how again all these things that were more fun and more memorable and exciting, didn't necessarily get all the acclaim. Who did Robert Zemeckis direct that? That again, Michael Douglas produced.
Yes, he did.
Kind of came out of nowhere, I guess, at the time, and yet now is so beloved compared to what year was that? 84. Compared to something like Places in the Heart.
Ugh, that was on my list.
It's not that bad.
I bring it full circle. Well, no, it's not. I mean, it's Sally Field and John Malkovich in heavy drama, Danny Glover, like you expect. And it's like, did it compare to the other films of 1984? No. And I almost
like the year of Amadeus. I mean,
yeah.
Amadeus is one of the best winners.
I'm going to have to add more to our list here. The 1980s winners we're going to have to talk about: Chariots of Fire, Gandhi, Terms of Endearment, Out of Africa.
My mom's favorite movie. Shout out.
Yes, Out of Africa is a guilty pleasure of mine. I love it. So I'm sorry, Kristin, you will not be able to avoid that.
Do I think it was better than A Color Purple? No. However, it's a sumptuous film. And Robert Redford has never looked better than in that movie. The unattainable stud. Sorry, I went all Blanche Devereaux. What were we talking about?
Hey, I got my Mike from Neighbors references in already, within important conversation. I'm Kristin Battestella at Therefore a Review. Yes, I should mention myself because I did have some of these things written at In Session Film as well. This has been a really great chat, ladies, and it's just again added more discourse that we now have to keep adding to the list. We have so many topics that we want to discuss. Love having all these voices heard. So you can follow us at insessionfilm.com. at Twitter at InSession Film. Ladies, thank you for being here. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you at the next Women in Session.
Do you find yourself wishing you had more energy, healthier habits, or fun family activities? At the YMCA, you can find your passion, find family fun, and find your happy place, all while supporting your community. Join the Y in March with a $0 enrollment fee and enjoy motivating group exercise classes, heated pools, pickleball, and so much more. Visit ymcadc.org to learn more and to find your nearest Y in DC, Maryland, or Virginia today.